My name is Teresa Parker, and we also have with us Edwina Peart and Phil Wood. We want to welcome everybody to this third session of Quaker Peace and Social Witness Spring sessions. We called this one Justice is Love in Action. So let's welcome to all. Welcome if you're feeling lively and energetic. Welcome if it's a bit of an effort to be here. And welcome if your hope needs a boost. And welcome if you're excited to be part of this. But also welcome if you're not sure if it's for you. And welcome if you need to eat your lunch or take a break or turn your screen off. And welcome to any members of your household who just might make an appearance. So just this really warm welcome to you and to those you carry in your heart. So this session explores how Quakers recognise the need for justice, and for Quaker Peace and Social Witness, this means putting love into action. Just note that this session is being recorded, and if you have concerns about this, please just tell Phil Wood in the chat. So here's what the session's going to cover. Our topic is Justice is Love in Action. We'll have some art to look at, short introduction about the work of Quaker Peace and Social Witness, and we'll hear from Edwina about justice and the context, and I'll add something in there too. We'll have a break about 1:10ish. After that, we'll look at how power and privilege affects what we directly do. And there'll be some small groups to talk about that. And we'll have some sharing at the end. We have sent out to everybody a care and conduct statement. It just sets out how each of us can create this as a good space to meet in. So it's part of Quaker spiritual practice to recognise that everyone has love and goodness and truth inside. And of course we make mistakes, and of course we can hurt each other sometimes. And we may feel that love is oh so well hidden in some people at some times. And at those very times, we find that seeking what love can do among us and in our world is our chosen way. And to do this, we need to join together to be strategic and reflective and imaginative and risk-taking. So this is the work that Quakers see the need for and which staff are tasked with doing. I'm going to ask Phil if he'll share a piece of art with us. This piece of art is called The Myth of Benevolence. Sometimes Quakers use art or music to aid reflection. So we offer this picture by Titus Kaffar. And in the next 5 minutes, you might like to reflect individually on the picture in silence, or put brief thoughts in the chat. What is the picture talking about? What might it be saying? So thank you, everyone. That's really interesting set of comments there. I'm going to return to this subject in a few moments, but just first of all, I want to do a brief introduction to QPSW, and I think Phil's got a few slides for us. I'd like to describe the work of QPSW using this graphic. At the top, you can see these red lines, which represent a lot of the issues which we see in QPSW are around in the world at the moment and have been for a long time. We see these in our culture, in our business life, in our faith institutions, in the criminal justice system, in our economic system. We see colonial legacies, racism, a crisis in the climate. And these are all issues which are human made. And so that means we can all change them. So this is the sort of problem identification part of the diagram. Because we're Quaker, these all come into a bowl or a filter or a dam that holds them We hold all these things in our lives, and we bring our Quaker discernment and our testimonies and our spiritual lives and our actions, and we put those together with these issues in a big pot, a big bowl. And we have all these things sitting there while we sit in worship with the Spirit. And in QPSW, we are led to make strategies. We are led to look at how change can happen. And we come up with various approaches, which you can see now coming out of this bowl: community-led peace building, partnerships, movement building, skills building, education, and political change. And after further discernment and thinking, we have over the years developed a number of ways of tackling what we see the issues are. So we form work areas or projects or programs. And these are the blue lines which flow out of our discernment. And it is these blue lines which the staff work on predominantly. So we may be divided up, the sort of equivalent of 15 full-time posts are divided up to work on these issues. So I hope that gives a good description of why we have worked on an activist gathering, on climate talks, on turning the tide in East Africa, and on the many other projects that we do. So I'm going to introduce you now to Edwina. She's going to give us an overview of the context in which there is a need for justice. And then I'm going to speak after her for about 5 minutes. So after about 15 minutes, we will have a short time for questions. So I think it's best if you could add those to the chat as we go along. That would be grand. Thank you very much. So over to you, Edwina.
Thank you, Teresa. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We're delighted. I'd like to start with where we are now, where we are today, and then go backwards to try and think about how we got to where we are. So Teresa has introduced us to QPSW and their vision of a peaceful and sustainable future. And that's very important, because for this to be a reality, peaceful and sustainable future, for it even to have a chance of succeeding, I think we have to base this on justice and equality. I'm sure that over the past year, you've heard the increasingly popular slogan, no justice, no peace. What do we actually mean when we speak of justice? I understand it as a concept of moral rightness, rightness based on ethics, rationality, law. In general terms, it's the act of being fair. And that sounds relatively simple, but it's actually not simple at all. So from a faith perspective, from a Quaker faith perspective, justice might include acknowledging that of God in everyone. And we could actually add that of God in everything. But Quaker faith and practice also adds an additional layer. It asks friends to seek to understand the causes of injustice, social unrest and fear. So it's not enough to just try to act in a fair way. You also have to understand why inequality, why injustice has emerged, why it exists. And I'd like to add to that an equality perspective. I want to draw on the Quaker testament to equality. And for human beings, I understand this to mean that our common humanity, I can hear that someone can't really hear me. I'll see what I can do with my audio settings. No, they're actually as high as they can be. I can't make them any louder. Is that okay? Can most people hear me? Yeah, great. Okay, so, okay, I'll try turning up my own volume. Does that make it any better? Can you hear me better now? Okay, maybe everyone needs to turn up their own volume if they're having difficulty. Okay, so back to an equality perspective on what that might mean for humans. I think it means that our common humanity transcends our differences. So it means that irrespective of race, class, age, sex, gender, we're more similar. We're more similar than we are different. But it also has a wider application. And for me, that's about the inseparable unity of life. And it's summed up in a phrase that I love, which is we all breathe together. All of life, literally and metaphorically. We inhabit, we exist in the same space. We're all affected by COVID. We're all affected by the climate crisis. We're all affected by racial hierarchies. We're all affected by all of the practices that divide us and that divide the different expressions of life and rank them. But how we're affected, that depends on the position we find ourselves in and the ways in which we're either integrated or excluded. So essentially for me, the truth holds that we live together on planet Earth and what happens to one affects us all. Kahindi Andrews, in his new book, The Age of Empire, The New Age of Empire, he says that the world can only ever be as equal as the knowledge that it's built upon. And so with that in mind, I want to dash through, and I really mean romp through, some history relating to racial inequality. I want to make two main points. And the first of these is around slavery. So we often think about Europe's venture into and its exploitative relationship with Africa as the beginning of modern day institutional racism. But actually there's little evidence to suggest that this is true. Europe's interaction with Africa represents a shift. But if we look closely, we can see that European civilization itself is made up of racial, tribal, linguistic, and regional particularities. And it was actually constructed out of difference. And it was constructed out of antagonistic difference. If we look at slave labor in particular, that was actually very important to the development of Europe. Nation states within Europe used slave labor for their armies, for their handicrafts, for their domestic service, industrial labor, ship and dock workers, field labourers. And how they got slaves, how they enslaved others, was largely through war and migration. And initially, it was mostly within Europe. So white servitude gathered casual labourers, it gathered migrants, it gathered criminals, and it gathered the very poor. And we can argue about the nature of slavery within Europe. We can discuss whether it was as evil as the transatlantic slave trade. But what I want to suggest here is that the framework for discrimination, the framework for unequal treatment and hierarchies of groups of people is as old as the continent of Europe, and it reflects lots of the structural relationships within it. The second point I want to make is about war, basically the role of violent suppression. And early European states were often war states. Their economies were war economies. What we understand as European civilization today largely comes from a group of people the Romans called barbarians. And the term barbarians was a collective term, and it was used to denote people who were outside of Rome's influence. So it didn't really say anything about the similarities between those people that were called barbarians. It functioned as a way of excluding. So it was speaking to the fact that these groups of people were outside of Roman influence. So they were almost the original others of Europe. And others could be grouped in terms of language. Then the basis of exclusion moved to geography and political affiliation. Then it moved to religious and spiritual affiliation. We can think about Christendom. We can think about the exclusion of Jews and the exclusion of Muslims. But even within religious affiliation, even within Christianity, there was division. And then we can think about the movement to modern, rational, scientific thought, which we often hold up as a philosophy that reduces difference. But actually, how it was used in this instance was to further justify distinction. So it extended the rationale for division rather than refuting it. And if we move from Europe as a big space and think about Britain just as an individual country within Europe, we can see that Britain was in a state of more or less constant war from 1688 to 1815. And in this war, the gun industry was very important to the state's survival. We can think about Samuel Galton, a Quaker, who was probably the most prominent gunmaker in England. And we're often told a story of Britain's transformation from an agricultural handicraft economy to one that's dominated by industry and machines. And we're told this as the story of the Industrial Revolution. We think of cotton factories and steam engines, individual genius and entrepreneurs. But this is only part of the story. There's increasing evidence for an alternative narrative. And in this alternative, the state drove the Industrial Revolution, and it drove it through war. The state was the largest borrower, spender, and employer. Guns enabled British armies, navies, mercenaries, traders, and settlers to intervene in and conquer a huge part of the globe. And so the tradition that already existed of racial distinction was available. It was available to be implanted on Asians, on Africans, and on other non-Europeans as it became appropriate. So what does this mean? What I'm trying to put forward here is that the unity of Europe as a continent is recent. The unity of Europe as a white continent only exists in relation to the black other. The idea that Africa and Africans are so different as to be feared is a fabrication. And it's a fabrication that falls apart when we realize that distinction and difference have long been important in European life and have been very important to power and privilege. Teresa.
Thank you so much, Edwina. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of how that is played out in our world today. So in QPSW, we would look at how this context affects the work that we might consider. And we might start by uncovering how a dominant white culture, which used slavery and colonialism, still reverberates in today's world. And because my area of work is crime and community and justice, the example I choose is of the police force. So we know from our earlier education about how local initiatives such as the Bow Street Runners in the 1750s and Peel's work to create a salaried police force in the 1820s. But what we hear less about is that in the 1780s, English politicians founded the first uniformed and armed police force in Dublin. Its purpose was to suppress the widespread objections to English colonial rule. And they made it work. You can read in the Encyclopedia Britannica that by the time Robert Peel became Chief Secretary for Ireland in 1812, and in quotes I say, Dublin was considered relatively free of crime. So just note that. Here, any activities that challenged the colonial state was identified as crime, and its suppression was considered successful due to the measures taken by the police. And of course, those suppressive measures, because the police force was armed, involved violence. And of course, violence has many different ways of acting in the world. And the colonial rulers, the English colonial rulers in Ireland, quickly realized that police practices to contain those who were challenging the organized political repression had to be wider than just this physical violence. And it was a well-known tactic for colonial rulers to recruit low-ranking police officers from the oppressed communities. And this gave some individuals in those communities power and economic security. And of course, that was then very divisive and wrecked community stability and imposed models of command and control into societies where they had perhaps functioned quite well prior to being colonized. This is the briefest of histories, and there's a great deal more on this subject to research. But I want to just take us forward a little bit to move on to what our response to such a history might be. And as Edwina was pointing out to us, we need to understand this part of police history still has a major impact. We need to ask questions when we see our police being given greater powers to decide who and how protest can take place. When we see Black people stopped and searched a great deal more frequently than white people. And when the police carry out acts of violence against Black people. And I'm going to leave it hanging there for now, and I'll be interested to know of your questions. Thank you.
Can we ask questions now?
Yes, please do. Please do, Bernie.
Yeah, thank you. In the community of Europe, I was thinking Roman values have sort of infiltrated the culture in terms of hierarchy, patriarchy, inequality, sexism, and homophobia. And it's still, I mean, I left the Catholic Church because of this, to become a Quaker, because the culture was more equal and more just. But I still think it's, I think patriarchy and sexism are still very prevalent. There's assumption that men are more are more able and more powerful, which they are, and it's changing, obviously. But I'm just thinking that this culture that we have to oppose and challenge all the time, or is it just me, my experience? As a gay man, I've experienced homophobia, so I'm just wondering what you think on that.
I wonder if you have a response, Edwina.
I have the beginnings of one. So I think that, yes, the societies in which faith groups, in which different denominations, in which groups of people are embedded, that impacts on those faith groups, on those groups of people. It's quite difficult to remove yourself entirely from the influences of the society in which you're based. But often, if we look at how religions, faith groups originated, it was in order to address some injustice, some social problems, some issues that were prevalent. But it seems that somehow, as they become more embedded, more powerful within the societies of which they're a part, they not exactly forget their origins, but they become, they move into a space where it's easier for them to fit in with the prevailing wisdoms, rather than retaining that cutting edge, much more radical note with which they often started.
Thank you, Edwina. Thank you. Do we have someone else with a question?
As someone who's always loved history, I feel that things are really being turned right inside out, which is amazing. I just wondered, it would be helpful to have some books or something to read that would really talk a bit more about from this perspective. I have got some on my shelf I haven't yet read. I've got David Onaswego's book, but I'm just wondering about if there are particular things you'd recommend, both on the police side, but also on the more general revisioning the way that European cultures and societies developed.
That there's a real wealth of information that's just available at the moment, and has been since, particularly since last year. And so there are lots of TV programs, there are lots of books that, even if they're old, are coming back into print and are being discussed. So this is one time when it really isn't as difficult as it used to be. You can Google something, you can just have a quick look and you'll find a lot of information is available. I particularly used Priya Satvia, Empire of Guns, and I also looked at Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, and I looked at Kahindi Andrews, The New Age of Empire.
Thanks, Edwina. Does anyone else have any questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, is there? Oh, from Sally.
Yes.
Are you saying that European civilization is the only civilization built on war, or is it true of all civilizations?
I would say 100% it is not the only civilization built on war. I'm not sure about the extent to which other civilizations were. I suspect that some of the great empires, most of the great empires historically were, but yeah, the reason why I'm saying this is just to trouble what we think we generally know. So we don't usually think of European civilization in some of the ways that I'm asking us to think about it today, but definitely it's not unique.
Okay, I think.
Okay, so I'm kind of listening with interest, but if the kind of differences that we make all the time, if they kind of lead to hierarchies, and most of the kind of things, injustice and violence is based on these hierarchies, how can we get to a place where we don't have hierarchies, and therefore we don't have inequalities based on power?
Lovely question. I'm not sure that I can do it justice, but I'll start. So I think that difference does not have to have the significance that we give it when we infuse it with power and privilege. So for example, if we just look at how Europeans first conceptualized, spoke about, and wrote about Africans when they first encountered them on their travels. They spoke about them as knowledgeable. They spoke about them as different, but not necessarily as inferior. They spoke about them as helping them. They spoke about them as sharing their knowledge with them. They spoke about their societies as quite sophisticated. When it changed, and what Europeans wanted was not just help and assistance from Africans, but wanted to exploit them to a greater level, wanted to exploit their labor power, wanted to exploit their mineral resources and other resources, then how they spoke about them, how they conceptualized them, started to change. And we can see the reverse if we think about European distinction. So the fact that, for example, Irish population were treated very badly at certain points in European history, but now have been incorporated. And that difference that once seemed to be so significant is no longer considered in that way. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that difference doesn't have to be significant. We make it so. We infuse it with significance according to what we want to do, what actions we want to justify, what needs as a society we feel we have.
Thank you, Edwina. We are unfortunately running out of time for questions, and I know there is probably a great deal more that people would want to say. And I do note in the chat some conversations about, well, I think particularly interesting one about Quaker approach to equality as being probably too cuddly. And I thought that was quite, that's a comment that might be worth talking about later when we get into our small groups. We're going to have a bit of a discussion or a conversation now between Edwina and I around the subject of how power and privilege has affected our work. And this is not scripted, so be interesting to see the directions we go in. And so I just wanted to start this morning. I was a bit on the wobbly side, and I was anxious about this session, which I knew I was going to be leading at lunchtime. And I was thinking about justice is love in action. And I was realizing that I could do it actually, because love being in action is such a precious idea to me. And I love Edwina, who I was going to be working with. And I love QPSW, whose work it describes. And I love the people who might come to join in because of their commitment and their time that they're giving up. And so, you know, it just felt that, well, I can only do this because of love, because it's the only power that works for me, and it's enough. And that really, I thought that then perhaps justice is love being celebrated. And that was my thought and my starter for the conversation. What do you reckon, Edwina?
I love that. I think that's a great way to start a conversation. Yeah, and I wanted to add to that some of my thoughts about my work and why I love some aspects of my work and why I find it very meaningful. So my focus has been on helping meetings, helping Quakers to address issues of power and privilege, and to examine some of the ways in which British society, the Quaker community, And the global society really is divided. But for me, what's best about that is that I'm not just interested in running a session that's interesting and that allows you to question yourselves, that allows you to examine your motivations and expand your knowledge, although I am interested in those things as well. But that's not my total interest. I'm also interested in helping you to reimagine, to think about a basis in the world from which your witness can emerge and from which your witness can expand. So I'm interested in helping Quakers to see how their faith can help them to address some of these fault lines in society. And so if I think about what we were speaking about before and the significance of difference, I can see that that has changed as the needs of society have changed. So we no longer have to enslave populations in ways that we did before to meet our labour needs. But we can still reserve, we can still maintain a pool of labour, a group of people that we can drag in and out of the economy as we need them. But now that group can be made up of migrants, refugees, the unemployed, the underemployed, the criminalised. We can relocate our businesses to parts of the world where labour is cheap. We can outsource labour. But if we as Quakers want to think about justice, and we want to think about love, and we want to think about unity, and if we want to think about how we can act fairly from a position of love that recognises that we all breathe together, what might that mean? Teresa and I were speaking about, earlier, we were speaking about projects that are important to us and that we think carries this work forward beautifully. And as we're speaking about it, we recognise that we're in a situation currently where some areas of QPSW work are being laid down, and crime and community justice appears to be one of those. But we had a choice. We could either speak to you about what we wanted to develop anyhow, or we could think, well, this might not happen. And we decided that we'd speak to you about it anyhow, because it's very important to us. And so from my perspective, the criminal justice system is at the cliff edge of institutional racism in this country, in this time. And so we can see the role of the state and its recourse to violence plainly here. And so I'll just hand over to Teresa to speak to you about one of the things we wanted to develop.
Thank you, Edwina. So Churches Together in Britain and Ireland invited us to chat, a discussion on Zoom called Black and Blue. And in it, there was quite a few serving Black police officers and a few retired who were talking about what that was like. They were confused, they were troubled, they were in pain, some of them, about what they were being instructed to do. They talked about the increasing force that police were being used, that they wanted to see themselves as a police service, not as a police force. And they said they were particularly concerned about the increase in the use of stop and search against Black people, which we've just seen in the police and crime new bill, where the powers have been strengthened. So they said the only way that they could think was that if some other group other than them could encourage the 80% of people who are stopped and searched, for whom no evidence is found for why that should have happened, they need to be complaining a lot more. And but there was no there were no sort of like complaints coming through to the police service about this, or not enough for them to take notice. And they were saying, please, can, you know, is there anyone, could there be help done with this? And so of course I hear a call like that and I think, yeah, things can be done about that. Maybe, you know, maybe Quakers could look into the police complaints system. Maybe Quakers could, you know, help people who've been in that circumstance. And there are so many that I think we won't have problems finding them. And I looked up, did a bit of research and looked up and said, there's an organisation called Netpol who do a lot of monitoring of the police activities. And, you know, they talked about, it's not just an urban problem. In fact, the figures, I was in Suffolk at the time, and the figures in Suffolk for stop and search were worse than they were proportionally than they were in London. And it seemed like the rural areas, you know, have a hard time. And so, yeah, there is so much that could be done there. And, you know, I'm sad that, you know, I don't know the future of any of this. But that's where we're at. And I think for this conversation, you've got a few sort of closing thoughts, Edwina.
I have, yeah. So I want us to think about how similar we are to America in terms of police violence, in terms of racial violence. And I want us to think about that because I was taken last year when much of the George Floyd killing and Black Lives Matter was just exploding. I was taken by the fact that British commentators, British politicians, all wanted to distance themselves and wanted to suggest and wanted to ask and wanted to comfort themselves with the statement that it's not that bad here. Well, it is. It is just that bad here. Obviously, we don't kill as many, our police don't kill as many Black people as they do in the States. But that's partly because our police aren't armed. They don't kill as many people, full stop. But if we look at incarceration, the Lammy report of 2017 shows us that the UK incarcerates proportionately more Black people than the US. That's a shocking statistic to me. And so I'm very interested and very committed to taking forward work that highlights this, but doesn't just highlight this, but that intervenes. So Teresa's idea is a bit fantastic for me because it asks us, are we prepared to be complicit in racist systems? If we're not, what action can we take now to bring about change? Where do we want to be? And I think that we stand at an important moment where our needs as a planet are clear. So what changes are Quakers going to make? What changes are Quakers going to advocate for? What unity are they going to reach for?
Thank you very much, Edwina. And now is the time when we're going to have some small groups.
Yeah, there's a question that we're asking you to address in your groups. And that question is, how would you use justice to put love into action?
We're going to move now into some sharing into the silence. And this is so that if people wish to, they can speak about something, speak briefly about something that was said in their group that they feel is for the benefit of all. And we'll keep that silence for about 10 minutes. And that will give us our time to hear some of what was raised in the group and what people had thought.
One thing that was said in our group was that it's often a lot easier to gather support for something you are for rather than something you're against. And if you have, it's something you want to try and promote as a positive, it's easier than being against something, which I thought was interesting.
So I can relate to what Rita says, and especially being a peace activist, I'd rather think of myself as working for peace rather than opposing war, which I am, but I'd rather put on a positive scale. And I think justice or compassion, which justice and compassion are the same thing, starts within ourselves and the people we love in our community, in our families. Sometimes we aren't compassionate with ourselves. We don't give ourselves justice, especially if you're a carer or a parent or a teacher or whatever. And then once you've looked after yourself, you've got the energy then, and then you and the facility to oppose injustice in society and in our communities. How we challenge injustice depends on our gifts, the gifts that we have, communication, and organising vigils or whatever. But yeah, thank you.
It is easy and just and loving to be for the return of looted cultural and art treasures from former colonial locations. I would suggest this as a pretty uncontroversial way forward. And the phrase looted art treasures, I think, is a very good one to use because it doesn't gloss over. And looting is something which is more often associated with disempowered minorities than with our betters, who have ever been brilliant exponents of corruption and looting. It's a way forward to acknowledge that by using that kind of language, I think.
In our group, we thought it was no good being cuddly, equality mongering Quakers. We had to keep addressing the power behind the inequality, whatever that might be, to effect change, and that we mustn't give up, and we've got to try and fight it wherever we can. Fight perhaps not being the right word.
The powerful will always abuse the weaker. You know, men will abuse women because they're stronger. Adults will abuse children because they're stronger. People will abuse animals because they're stronger. It's just the way it is. So to get to the core of it, the best description of spirituality I've heard is developing a feeling for other human beings. A spirituality. This is a problem for the secular world, the word spirituality, but they do use the word emotional intelligence. It needs to be taught in schools. We need to teach it in schools. There's been a lot of the sustainability issue has been taught in schools, and that's had an effect already on the children. And I think it's time now for spirituality in some way to be taught in schools.
I wonder about the possibility of individuals everywhere to be given the opportunity and the encouragement to be courageous and to confront or to challenge maybe the powerful for whom they work. We have seen police officers on television who have tried to avert disasters, stop their fellow policemen from hurting somebody. And I wonder what opportunity, say, for one example in particular, the police have in their own training and so on, to put forward ideas and concepts of a different nature to reaction of violence. You must need a great deal of courage to challenge that, I think. But maybe we need to give a lot of encouragement in schools, in youth clubs, in churches, everywhere, to the individual having the courage to stand up and not bow to the hierarchy.
I think it always strikes me that it seems to be really important to the hierarchy that the roots of where that hierarchy has come from or is based on has to stay hidden. You know, I mean, often when we have discussions about racism, you know, most people or so many people will say, oh, you know, they didn't really know or they weren't aware of it. And I always find that a bit baffling because it seems such an effective system. You know, I mean, there have to be people involved in it that are much more purposeful than, you know, some of us then can. I think it's true that some of us can even imagine. And I just think the way, I mean, if you look at Black communities, generally speaking, it's a big, huge generalization, but they're much poorer, you know, and people say, oh, yes, you know, some people are able to say, well, it's because of racism and history they've come out of. Well, I'm quite sure if we had more information, we'd see some very wealthy people in our society and we'd be very aware that their wealth has been passed on through generations as a result of, you know, slavery and colonialism. I think C.L.R. James said slavery was the biggest money-making machine the world has ever seen. And I just think if that was that understanding of the way we are and how we are was more readily available to people, if it was just out there, I think that would have a huge impact. Because at the moment, you know, people, I mean, Etonians can present themselves as being, you know, these superior, very intelligent, talented people, you know, that are born to power. And actually, you know, I suspect it's a theory, or maybe it's common sense, but I think they're there because of slavery and colonialism. You know, there'll be a huge percentage of people that, you know, that can enjoy that kind of lifestyle, that are enjoying it because of, you know, that history, in the same way that, you know, we've still got very poor people really struggling, you know, getting sent back to Jamaica after living here for 50 years and finding themselves relatively powerless to do anything about it.
Thank you, Yasmin, very much. I think on that point we will have to end. Just really want to say thank you everyone so much for being part of this. Very much hope that you'll use the feedback form which Phil will send you to give us your sense of how it was. Don't also forget that there's 3 more sessions to come, and we look forward to seeing you there. For now, I think we'll say goodbye for those that are going, and just many thanks. Goodbye.